give the example of that lowest adjacent area, the lower adjacent areas, and then Matt will be talking in more detail about our Shoreline District rules. So we do have, in this example here, that pinkish area is the official FEMA map. And you guys are going to understand contours and can see that this does not line up very well with the ground. But our state law says that adjoining areas to the floodplain, if they're below the flood elevation, that they're still regulated just like the mapped areas are, according to, based on state law. So that's what the local authorities need to regulate now that we have the better LIDAR and elevation these areas than it was, even though this law has been there for 50 years. It's really been in recent years that we've been able to use it better. We do have public water permits and rules, and those started over 100 years ago that the state started defining public waters. In the 30s, they started regulating those public waters. But as I show in red, division of drainage, the focus was probably a little different back in the 30s in our regulations, and they've changed quite a bit over the years. But they started looking at regulations for any changes to the course, current, or cross-section of our public waters. We had a few decades of controversy over which basins, which lakes, which water courses that included, and what specific things were regulated. So in '76, they started an inventory program, defined what size basins and wetlands and what types of wetlands were included, and that water courses draining more than 2 square miles were included. Went through that inventory for over a decade it took, and lots of public meetings and controversy, and a few tires slashed at those meetings if they had DNR on the side of the vehicle. It was a lot of fun. Luckily, I wasn't personally involved, but what I hear from my coworkers who involved with that process, it was a tough process. And they also became more specific in the regulations. The official boundary is called the ordinary high. It's based on physical evidence. We've got a lot more detail on how that's determined. I think a lot of other states have similar laws and wording, so I won't get into detail there. But we do have an official boundary. It's been tested in court many times. We do have in our DNR area hydrologists who work in different parts of the state. They're our main staff working with those public water work permits. And they also are our first line of defense in working with communities on their land use programs, with their floodplain and their shoreland management programs. Another agency in the state is the Board of Water and Soil Resources, which we call Bowser. And they also have regional staff that work with the different programs. And one of the other big programs we have statewide was our Wetland Conservation Act that was adopted in 1991. And it regulates the draining and filling of the wetlands that are not public water wetlands that are regulated by those DNR permits. And just in general, I'll say that they have the evaluation panels. It's very locally administered, and some very nice regulations there with the goal of no net loss, the avoid minimize, and then having to replace anything that is filled in or drained. And I do have a link in here if that works when I share the slides. They're in the process of looking at state assumption of section 404, and there's a nice little presentation, about a half an hour presentation you can look at if you're interested in that. I did see while I was putting that together that Michigan and New Jersey have already assumed the section 404 programs at the state level. So we're looking at that also. Where'd my, keep going, come on. There we go. We've also had a buffer project, mandatory permanent buffers, 50 feet on public waters, a rod on ditches. And there's a map of that. That's a more recent effort. So a lot of things helping protect the wetland areas. And I'm going to turn it over to Matt.
Yeah, can you hear me?
We can.
Excellent. So I'm going to touch on Minnesota's shoreline management program with an emphasis more on those items that your average floodplain administrator from other states can perhaps steal from or borrow from or be inspired by, whatever it may be. We're one of a few states around the country that has a shoreline management program. Wisconsin has one statewide. We have one statewide. There's a handful of other areas that have similar shoreline programs for targeted areas. But it was started in 1969 when when many other nationwide environmental regulations were put in place. And I mean, we value our lakes and we care about water quality. There's a ton of fishermen and we like to fish, we like to swim in our lakes, and it's a part of our identity. But we are recognizing that a lot of our lakes were, development around them was getting out of hand and it wasn't being done in an environmentally sensitive way. Septic systems were a huge issue, and they established a shoreline management program at that time. What they did is they more or less borrowed from Wisconsin's, but what Ceil likes to say is we made it better. And what the program regulates is, in counties, it regulates lands or lands around water bodies greater than 25 acres in unincorporated areas of the county, and lands around basins greater than 10 acres that are in incorporated cities. Additionally, lands around larger wetlands, as well as all public water, rivers, and streams. You know, and that's pretty extensive. So all of those basins and streams are classified. So there's a classification process that was established along with our rules, recognizing that larger water bodies are just more resilient to pollution and land developments. So those can be developed more intensively than your smaller water bodies, by and large. So based on what classification the water body is, influences the lot area, lot width, structure setbacks, as well as septic setbacks. These septic provisions were the first provisions in the state regulating septic systems, and then thereafter, with Clean Water Act, that was built upon and actually outsourced to a different state agency, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. But those septic setbacks still remain in place and are largely followed statewide. Next slide. So the Shoreline District around all these rivers and basins, around lakes, it's areas within 1,000 feet of a lake or pond or basin, what we call them, and 300 feet from a river or stream, as well as the landward extent of the floodplain. So if the floodplain extends out of those areas, shoreline provisions apply as well. Next slide. So I'm going to get into a handful of standards, but I'm going to emphasize the minimum elevation standard, and I'm going to touch on that standard last. This graphic here comes from our model ordinance. Our model ordinance contains many different graphics to help explain different points in a visual way. This one here highlights our setback averaging provision. So we have setbacks, and you know, there's non-conforming structures that were built before the regulations were put in place, and the setback averaging accommodates for existing development, and it allows you to encroach inside that setback. So that's what this graphic helps to visually show. Next slide. The first major standard that I'm going to talk about is just setbacks, and they're variable based on the classification of the water body, and it's, you know, it's just to keep development away from shore. I mean, anytime you're building a house near shore, you're destroying all the vegetation around it. There is construction runoff. You're putting in a septic system, and we want that septic system further away from shore. But the more development we put in, the more septic systems you got. So it helps protect that near shore habitat. You know, we lose that, we lose a lot of habitat for near shore critters, and then it results in more runoff, and then hurts the near shore critters that are that live in the water as well as holds the soil in place. I mean, right now we're having more variable water elevations due to climate change. We're getting huge cigar boats and big wakeboard boats that throw huge wakes and destroy a lot of nearshore vegetation, and it just helps hold it in place. Not to mention the program also promotes scenic quality, and just keeping structures away from shore helps promote scenic quality as well. Next slide. We regulate bluffs in the shoreland program. By the way, it's all enforced at the local level. We, as DNR, just approve those local ordinances. We also provide technical assistance. We might challenge variances here and there. But bluffs. Bluffs are defined. We have setbacks from bluffs. It's not a perfect definition. We have another land use program that has built off of this definition and made it a little better. So I guess I wouldn't recommend any community steal this particular definition, but if you have, but if it's something that you might want to implement, hit us up and we can share a definition that we've developed that's a little better. But by and large, the program defines a bluff, anything 30% or greater over any 25-foot rise. And then we have, you know, protections within that area for vegetation removal and setbacks above the bluff as well. Vegetation removal, we do have vegetation removal standards. They're incredibly difficult to enforce just because most removal activities don't, the resident isn't getting a permit. And but they exist. People in Minnesota know they exist. They don't necessarily know the details, and our standards are pretty mushy, to be honest. But we give communities recommendations for how they can strengthen them. Particularly, we recommend communities insert a provision in their ordinance that addresses violations and guides the restoration activities that they have to do if they get caught. So there's exceptions to vegetation removal. You can open up a limited amount of space to accommodate a view. You can clear a limited amount of area for like what we call like a water-oriented accessory structure. It's not a boathouse. It's a place to store your life jackets and fishing gear and whatnot. It's a very small structure. We have impervious surface standards. Most of you guys on this call know what that are, so it's not anything groundbreaking or anything, but we limit impervious surfaces to 25% on each lot. The rules are made before pervious pavement, so it's kind of squishy. Some people have instead enforced a hard surface standard, which is a better standard. But minimum elevations. So where floodplain data does not exist, we have minimum elevation standards within the Shoreland District. So the minimum elevations are 3 feet above the ordinary high water level or the highest known water level, whichever is greater. And we have a lot of unmapped areas. We have a lot of our basins are entirely unmapped. So this regulates a good chunk of land in Minnesota. We have a ton of basins and you can't map them all. There's just inadequate data. So this slide, and I think there's an animation here, but this slide shows a mapped basin and the extent of the Shoreland District, 1,000 feet out. So the minimum elevations would apply here, and Minnesotans like digging basements. We do it for you know, efficiency purposes, for storage. We all like our basements. And you know, traditionally you can go right outside the floodplain, you can dig a basement, and you know, during high water events you can get a ton of seepage and a good chunk of basement flooding. Well, the shoreline program doesn't allow that. So it extends those minimum elevation standards beyond just the floodplain district. And the map on the right shows all of our counties that are unmapped, and this is predominantly in Lake Country. And what we found is, over time, I mean, these provisions have been in place since 1969. So when areas get newly mapped, we have fewer nonconformities. And I mean, maps get updated all the time. This provision has been a huge savior for Minnesota, and it establishes those minimum elevations in areas where we don't have mapped floodplains right now. I mean, maps are getting updated all the time. This has been great for us. The shoreline program also offers ordinance flexibility for particularly central business districts that are already fully developed, that would have a ton of nonconformities. You know, the septic standards, the minimum lot size standards are too burdensome on these communities, and we offer negotiated flexibility between the local community and the DNR. I think I got one more slide, Ceil. No, I got two more. And you know, there's just challenges administratively. Some local communities embrace the standards, others not so much. Some communities really abuse these standards through the variance process, and we have a limited capacity to control that. But by and large, folks in the state think that the benefits of this program outweigh the downsides. But you know, the types of development has changed over time. You know, it's not just small cabins anymore. But also, a lot of these standards, they don't necessarily work in a traditional floodplain ordinance. And I think that for your average floodplain administrator, I think it's important to recognize when it's appropriate to insert a provision into your floodplain ordinance versus when it's appropriate to just insert it into a separate overlay district. Since you know, when you insert it into a floodplain ordinance, you're also taking on all the nonconformity restrictions for substantial damage and substantial improvements. You have to do evaluations after disasters and that sort of thing. So communities are always interested in impacts on existing development. They hate dealing with grandfathering, as everybody on this call realizes. So that's just something to keep in mind. So I think that's my last slide, Ceil.
Okay, thanks, Matt. So I'm going to spend the last 10 minutes here going through, focusing more on some of the common higher standards that our communities and watershed districts have. And in our model ordinance, our model floodplain ordinance, we actually have some of these higher standards. For example, the critical facilities outside of the 0.2% floodplain, a dry land access requirement, that you have access, you don't leave these buildings on islands stranded in the middle of the floodplain, that you have access that's not too far below the flood elevation. We have the cumulative substantial improvement determination language there, and that's cumulative improvements since they adopted the ordinance in that community instead of just the substantial improvement at that time. And the substantial damage definition that is used for the increased cost of compliance, rep loss, that rep loss language that you've got. And most communities do adopt these, and The one that they probably don't adopt as much is the cumulative substantial improvement language, but the others, they really, most of the communities do adopt it. We're not sure if it's because they didn't read the whole draft that we gave them, or if they actually realize that, yeah, these are good things to do for the long-term protection of their citizens. We used to give them our model ordinance and then a separate document saying, hey, and here's some things that we'd encourage you to adopt. Very few of the communities would make the extra effort to put the suggestions into the model, into their ordinance. But once we put it in the ordinance and we put little notes on the sidebar telling them it was an optional part of the ordinance, most of them did keep it. Some common higher standards we see in many of our cities and counties that do the zoning is many of our rural counties, especially after they had some big rains in the 2007 and 8 and 10, the southern Minnesota got hit with lots of flooding 3 times within about 5 years. And so many of the rural counties said, hey, we got space on these lots where they can be building and out of the floodplain. Why are we letting them even bother to build in the floodplain? So many of those counties did adopt that. There's one county that doesn't allow any new building in the 500-year floodplain. That did start because the local official was misreading the and telling people they couldn't build any place that was gray on their map. And then they did make their ordinance follow what they had been enforcing. But the other situation we see often is with small cities, we offer them what we call a simplified ordinance that basically says, don't build anything in the floodplain. And for those small cities that don't have a lot of development pressure, they don't want to deal with the difficult floodplain ordinance and figure out what minimum elevations are and that kind of stuff. And they say, hey, we got plenty of places to build in the city without going into that floodplain area. We're just going to adopt a simplified ordinance that says you can't do anything in the floodplain. Many communities have higher minimum elevation standards. Some of them are basing it on higher calculations that they've done, more future condition types of approaches. Some, and at least in one community, our minimum elevation's kind of complicated to figure out because you got to figure out what the stage increase is and add that in. And she showed what she had to do to her county board and said, this is complicated. Can't I just round it up and say we're going to have a 2-foot freeboard instead of 1 plus whatever our stage increase is? And they agreed to that. So a lot of different approaches on how they set those minimum elevations. Quite a few communities do have other impervious surface limitations beyond what's in the shoreland. And also quite a few require minimum elevations outside of the mapped floodplains and outside of the shoreland areas, even within their entire community. And I'm going to do a quick example. One community that has some higher standards, City of Plymouth. It's in the western suburbs of Minneapolis. It's located right here. It's a 2nd tier community, suburb there of Minneapolis. And in the late 80s and the 90s, basically, they were growing like crazy. And I was actually the area hydrologist, fairly new area hydrologist in the city when some of these big developments were first starting. And so as area hydrologist, I would say, hey, this is the boundary of these public water wetlands. You cannot fill below these boundaries. And I tried suggesting that they have higher elevations and some setbacks, but they said, hey, you can't make us. And so they were building as close as they could. And in this particular spot, I remember they had a big rain, and one of the houses that was just being built, the basement was in there. It was still open, big rain, basement filled up like a swimming pool, the whole foundation buckled. And they started realizing, gee, maybe it isn't such a good idea to put our buildings so low in these areas. Another example was a development called 7 Ponds. because it had a bunch of ponds. Some of them were ones that I had jurisdiction over and could say, you know, what the boundary was, and you shall not fill beyond this area. But and I tried arguing for setbacks there, and they said, "Oh, it's all gonna, you know, people don't care about backyards here. It's going to be empty nesters." And I had a toddler at the time, and I said, "You know, you're marketing to people like me with young families. Your people are going to complain. They're going to want more than 10 feet that you left for setbacks from our wetlands." And what ended up happening was they built them. They had the houses really close to the wetlands, and they said, "You talk to the DNR, and if the DNR will let you do something, you can do it." So I had about a third of the people in this development calling me up and asking, "Oh, can I just fill a little bit here to put in a playset? Oh, can I fill a little here? I need a little bit bigger yard. Oh, I want to put in a deck. I want to put in a gazebo. I want to do this. I want to do that." And I was the bad guy saying, "Nope, you can't do anything. You cannot build anything. You cannot put any fill beyond that line." Well, I guess the good news is that a lot of people complain to their council. There's at least one person on their council who works for our pollution control agency and was interested in some of the higher standards. And at least one of the local engineers in the area recognized the minimum elevations was a good idea because his basement got flooded. It was a newer building. So the city did adopt a requirement in the entire city that the lowest floor be 2 feet above their calculated 1% annual chance flood elevation. They also realized, gee, let's have some setback, let's have some buffers. And so they classified their wetlands, excellent and medium and poor quality kinds of things. And they had setbacks and buffer requirements. They also required 4x4 monuments that said it was the wetland buffer to help people identify where those boundaries were. We have, in addition to our communities that have their zoning regulations, we have watershed districts. They've been around for a long time, and they can adopt their own rules that apply within the communities. They do a lot of modeling. They have a lot of great projects they do. They do some grant and cost sharings in their communities, doing a lot of great work. And especially in the Red River Valley and in the metro area, they're very strong. Some of the common things you especially see at the watershed level are the regulations not allowing increases in the peaks of the runoff or reducing the volumes coming off the sites, water quality improvements, all kinds of things. So I'm just going to run through a few pictures from my area that I was taking. Little ponding area that this church had to do when they expanded their parking. This happens to be my polling place, and I took that on November 3rd. This is a ponding area in my community. I rushed out after a few inches of rain one day and took pictures of all of our stormwater ponds. So that was partly filled in. But these are multi-use areas. So that area, when it's not right after a flood, is used for things like these little kids playing soccer. Retrofits, some great projects. This is my local Target. They did the rain garden. Had a nice little sign pointing out that's what it was. And being Minnesota, they had to have signs saying, "Hey, snowplow drivers, don't dump your snow in this area." Communities can use the regulations, and if they want to have a bigger toolbox and get into more watershed level planning and prioritizing, risk communication, education, a lot of other good things. Here's a sign that a little community put about their rain garden, little community of just over 1,000. So it's not necessarily the big cities and suburbs. A lot of good watershed level planning in the state. And we have what's called One Watershed, One Plan statewide. We've got some brand new videos talking about how One Watershed, One Plan works. And I've got a link here to that here. I've talked before about our state amendment giving some funding to do a lot of great projects that helps our floodplains and especially our natural beneficial functions of the floodplains. We've got educational materials at DNR. This is a more recent document we did on shoreline alterations and some high water guidance, trying to encourage that vegetation staying there versus the sod down to the lake that erodes away. And I'm going to end with a few slides of a naturalized stormwater pond that's near my house. There's some, it's hard to see mixed in there, but those are milkweed plants that the monarchs like. And this is, unfortunately, they got their annual cuttings a little earlier than the season that I prefer. This was where some of the milkweed was. Another example of some plants that I had taken this picture because I was trying to figure out what the heck this yellow plant was. And the next day it had been cut and there wasn't much left. So good guidance is out there. This, many of you are familiar with ASFPM's information. And on our state site, we've got some innovative standards, basically higher standards. And my parting shot here, exciting Strauss a vacation slide. Some of you are going to recognize this, especially Stacy, if he's looking here. This is in Gulfport, Mississippi. We're driving by and I go, oh, I got to get a picture of that. That's one of those infamous bathrooms that I've heard about at ASFPM. And that's my daughter there for scale, showing the heights of the base flood elevations and the previous flooding there. So I will stop sharing and turn it back.
So has Jennifer come into the room? I didn't see her in the participants list.
I did not see her, Bill. This is Stacy.
Okay, well that gives us a little more time. And forgive me, I'm a little bit amateurish on Zoom. I think there is a way to raise your hand, but I can't seem to find the control for that. We have a few minutes if people want to ask questions and unmute yourself, but oh, I see. You just go and do a reaction thumbs up thing like that. Okay.
That's correct, and you can raise your hand, or you can type it in the chat, either or.
Okay. We have a thank you in the chat, but would anybody like to ask a question? Steve, your thumb is up. You could unmute yourself.
Ceil, you mentioned the prohibition against pollutants. Where do you get your list of pollutants that are prohibited? A state agency or federal?
It's in our state rules. We've got language about that, and I could send you some of those references. And in fact, we're working on what we call a deep dive of our model ordinance. And Matt was recently putting together kind of a layout of our floodplain rules reference our pollution control agency definitions, and in those pollution control agency definitions, it talks about what's considered pollutants.
Thank you, Ceil. I had a hazardous materials prohibition, and we had a federal agency said something wasn't hazardous, and a state agency that said it was, and the property owner was arguing that it wasn't so that he could have the development.
Yeah, and ours is pretty broad because it includes dredge spoils, and just sediment is considered a pollutant because that carries the nutrients that are pollutants. So it's a nice broad, and the wording is anything that would be injurious to plants, people, and animals is part of that definition. Can't be in the areas that would be flooded.
There's a comment from somebody from Iowa saying that there's a bill in their state legislature sponsored by the Iowa Home Builders Association restricting state and local stormwater regulations to the federal minimums. And the question is, has ASFPM seen other similar examples? Having spoken to people in Wisconsin, I believe that the previous administration in Wisconsin had a similar requirement. I'm not from Wisconsin, so I'm not sure, but if anybody wants to speak to that, or perhaps other state regulations that say, no, you can't go above and beyond.
Must not be anyone.
Yeah, I do know Wisconsin was definitely struggling with that. And so they were, Michelle's staff, when she was the state floodplain manager, was trying to lay low on letting them know some of the things were higher standards.
Oh, and this was Julie Tellman that issued that question. If there aren't any more questions, we can go on to the next speaker. And this is Jason. Is it schooling or sculling?
That's schooling.
Schooling, okay. And Jason is a PE and a planner, CFM, and a certified Envision sustainability professional, and he could explain what that means, but specializes in land use planning and permitting in New Jersey. And what got him into this meeting was a conversation that we had. We were talking with our core group, and we were talking about benefit cost analysis and the idea that benefit cost analysis doesn't do justice when you're talking about climate change. And even further discussion, it doesn't really do justice when you're talking about environmental justice, in which lower income or lower valued properties don't do as well as higher valued properties. So asked Jason if he could speak to it, and he said, well, we don't have an engineering presentation on this. I said, well, I don't think that's what we need, but I think we would like to generate some discussion. So Jason, if you'd like to share your screen, I believe you've got that ability.
Absolutely. Let me throw this up here.
You're there.
You guys can see it? All
Yep.
right. So, well, I guess to answer your first question there, what Envision sustainability professional is, Envision is essentially LEED. I think most people seem to be familiar with LEED, kind of green, resilient design, everything. It's kind of LEED for infrastructure. So for me as an engineer, since I'm not a structural engineer or an architect, it seemed to make more sense for me to design more resilient and green and sustainable infrastructure and site design for people and to be able to work with my clients. So I am a consultant engineer with Paula Sokolowski and Sartor, or PSNS for short, and I specialize in site development and land use planning and permitting. So about a year and a half ago, there we go. About a year and a half ago, I was a part of a small focus group within my company where we're trying to look at how we can better serve our clients by ensuring that what we build and what we design is more, to the greatest extent possible, future-proof. So that we're not only meeting what the current standards are and the current regulations are, but that we're also preparing that whatever is being built is going to also be safe and resilient for whatever future climate conditions may come up. Too often we've seen when we design stuff, it meets all current requirements, it gets approved, it gets built, and then several years down the line, after increased storm intensities or after storm surge and sea level rise, what they built is no longer safe, that their assets are now at risk, that they have to pay higher flood insurance premiums, and that they may have to put in more money in order to raise what they already put in. So what we're trying to figure out here is what information was out there that could project what future conditions might be, so that we can give this information to our clients so that they can make more informed decision and know what their options are and what they're building. So what we end up using as our main resource there was the ASCE Climate Resilient Infrastructure, but there are also several other resources that I'll supply at the end, where we're able to pull this information from and see what future projections there are in each of these areas. The Climate Resilient Infrastructure book focused on a lot of different climate things and where they may be, including drought, including landslides, temperature change, winds and cyclones, and all different things along those lines. But as floodplain managers, the two areas that we're probably most focused on would be sea level rise and rainfall intensity changes. The simplest takeaway from this is that any model that they put in demonstrates that sea level is rising and that rainfall intensities are increasing and getting worse down the line. They broke it down into different columns here, as you can see. What would be a low estimate for future years, what would be the mid-range or the most likely outcome. And here's the 25 to 75% confidence percentile, and then would be the high estimate. So if everything goes wrong and full tilt, this would be the worst case scenario. So we were able to take this data and trying to see how can we apply this to create a benefit cost analysis for our client. So again, that they can make a more informed decision and figure out what options that they have. So the different questions that we asked in order to prepare this for people is, first of all, what's being built? How critical is it? How costly would it be if it were to fail? The second thing is, what's the useful life of what's being designed? And the third thing is, what's the actual construction cost? To be able to compare raising it to a higher elevation to what it would be to just meet the bare minimum. So looking at, oh, I skipped one there. No, I didn't. All right, so the first question that we end up asking is that as a consultant engineer is, what does my client want to build? How critical is the structure and how costly or inconvenient will it be if it fails or becomes inaccessible? There's a big difference between if we want to build a small farm road that goes over a bridge that we know if there's a serious storm event that's coming through, this is never going to be accessed. They're just going to stay off the road and don't have to worry about what's on the other side. The farmer that we're working with in that case might not care about building things to a higher standard. They might just say, I just wanted to get this approved, and if it floods, it floods. So in that case, we might not look at this at all, or if we do, we may just looking at what the lowest estimate is for future projections. If this, on the other hand, is a single family home, a residence, or if it's a retail, commercial, warehouse, office complex that's being built, then if this were to fail, if this were to flood, then there would be more serious or significant cost associated with the damages for that particular owner. So in that case, we look at the middle, or what's the most likely scenario of where flooding would be during the lifetime of what they're building. And if it's a critical structure, anything that would result in a significant loss of life, anything that needs to be working for emergency purposes, or just things that need to be constantly available and no matter what the conditions are, then we look more at the high estimates here. So that'd be the things like schools and hospitals, substations, police and fire, or a bridge that may be access to a barrier island so that people can get either on or away from their homes. So the second thing after knowing what is being built is the life cycle of what's being constructed. Now, if we're building a single family home or purchasing a single family home, you typically get a 30-year mortgage. Even if you don't plan on living in it for the full 30 years, you want to make sure that it's going to be standing for the full 30 years and will be resilient and be able to withstand anything that's going to come at the end of that 30-year life cycle. I don't know how well you guys can read this because it's probably fairly small, but I just gave some other examples of the life cycle of different types of structures. Like we have here, roads are expected to last only like 10 to 20 years, bridges 50 plus, a dam 50 to 80, or substations could be anywhere from 35 to 80 years. So we want to make sure that whatever we're building isn't just going to be safe today and meet standards today, but as sea level rise increases during future years, as rainfall intensities increase and the elevation of flooding is going to get higher and higher, that these things will also be protected and safe at the end of their life cycle. So New York Climate Resiliency Design Guidelines prepared something that kind of took this into account. And I live in New York and work in New Jersey, so this is going to be geared a little bit more towards the tri-state area, but it's still applicable. What we're looking at here is in the first column, they take the base flood elevation, they add freeboard, whether it's critical facility or non-critical facility, and this is what's in the New York regulations to go 2 feet of freeboard for critical and 1 foot for non-critical, and then they apply the sea level rise adjustment. Now these numbers are the middle of that middle column that I showed you guys previously. So given an example here, if we were to take a single family home that has a 30-year life or 30-year mortgage that we're building today, then we'd want to see in 2050, 30 years from now, how much higher should I build it to where I know it's going to be safe to where that sea level rise is most likely going to be at that time. So in this case, that says 16 inches. So we would take the bare minimum plus 16 inches in order to make sure that this home is going to be safe to the most likely future scenario. And this doesn't just apply to sea level rise. There's also numbers and data that we can see for precipitation, because even rainfall intensities just seem to be getting more frequent and higher intensities. So this again looks at a low, middle, and high estimate for rainfall as well. So the third step here is we know what we're going to build. We know what the life cycle of what we're building is, but what's probably most important to our clients is what is the actual cost. So we can look at what's the cost to build it at the bare minimum, and then what's the cost in order to build it at a higher elevation in order to safeguard it against future projections. So here, the American Institute for Research prepared a study that is called the Evaluation of the National Flood Insurance Program's Building Standards, where they used the FEMA's Benefit Cost Analysis Toolkit to try to get ideas of how much more it would cost to be able to build a structure to a higher elevation. So they took into account things like discount rates, various building types, and this is mainly for single family homes. So the footprint, number of stories, foundation types, and its location, whether in different flood zones and also the different places around the nation that it could be built, and also depth damage functions. And they looked at here, they took what's the average cost to build it, and then what would be the increase in cost if they were to raise it 1 foot, 2 feet, 3 feet, and 4 feet. So they did this and split it up into V zone construction, coastal A zone construction, and A zone construction. And they had a range here for it's going to be like for a V zone, if you raise it 1 foot, it would be 0.4 to 1.8% increase in construction cost. Now, FEMA took this one step further in the study aptly named the supplement to the evaluation of the National Flood Insurance Program's building standards, where they also incorporated savings that you would get from a decrease in flood insurance payments in the premium. So here, these first 3 columns are the same. They had added a column here for the savings that you would accrue from reduction in flood insurance. And the last column here to the right is what would be the average payback period in order to recoup from how much you would pay initially. So you're paying more, but you're going to be paying less in insurance each year. So how long would it take to earn that money back? So using the same example that we brought up in the beginning about a single family home, 30-year mortgage that you'd have to raise about 16 inches, that would fall in the 1 to 2 feet rise area. And the average time to be able to bring that to recoup the additional construction cost in a V zone would be under 2.5 years. In a coastal A zone, it'd be probably in the ballpark of 5 years, and an A zone between these two, so around 4 years. So if we could present this to a homeowner or a developer, they can get a better idea. It's like, okay, this is what my options are, and this is how much it would cost and how much it would take to recoup the initial cost that I put into it. Taking this one step further, we looked at what the construction cost was. We looked at what it would be to initially build it higher, but what if we built it at the bare minimum and then wanted to raise it at a future date because flood elevations are getting greater. I tried looking at various sources around our area, and it's difficult to really peg in one number for how much it would cost to raise a structure, but the general range that I was finding is that it's going to be between $10,000 to $30,000 in order to raise a structure to a higher elevation. So what this table here is showing, it's taking that study that I shared with you earlier, the American Institute for Research, they estimated how much it would cost to build certain structures within a floodplain. So on the low end, they had a 1-story, 1,500 square foot building. And on the high end for what they were estimating was a 2-story, 4,800 square foot building. So I took the average cost that they had for both of those studies, applied the increased cost that they generated before to figure out numbers for how much additional cost it would be in order to raise those structures. Now, if you look at this range here for the 1-story, 1,500 square foot, there were only 2 that even fell into that lower range of cost to rise of 10,000 square feet. So if we were to present this to a homeowner or a developer, they would see is like it may be cost beneficial to just to construct it at a higher elevation rather than try to raise it at a later date. For a 2-story of a larger footprint, there were situations where the cost is probably going to be comparable. So we can give this as an option to a homeowner or a developer, and they can assess and see, like, does it make more sense? Is this something that I would rather do financially, put this money up front to better protect my house, to better protect my building, or would I just rather wait it out and see if I should just raise it at a future date? One other quick thing to use as just food for thought here is it possible to create an adjustable or iterative design? What I mean here is looking at this example, this is the Lausanne rail corridor that goes between Los Angeles and San Diego. And one of the things that they were able to figure out with this design is they created these piers so that you could later insert additional pier segments if they needed to raise it up. So if they can build it as cheaply or as low as possible today, and then if the flood elevations continue to rise at a future date, they wouldn't have to completely demolish and remove and replace the piers. They could just take the precast pier segments to be able to rise up the bridge elevation to a higher elevation. I know adjustable design maybe not applicable in most cases, but this is just something, an additional thing to be able to keep in mind. So I know I'm on the design end of things here, and chances are most of the people that are on this call are municipal floodplain managers. So how does this apply to you guys? Well, there are a lot of resources that are out there that we can make available to homeowners or for those or developers so they can know what their options are, so they could have a better idea of what the cost is and what it would take to be able to either build it now or make changes down the line. One of the best things I've seen out there is the FEMA Benefit Cost Analysis Toolkit. It's a great self-assessment tool where people can plug in site-specific information to be able to get a better idea of what the risk is and also what the cost is in order to raise up what they're looking to design. There's a bunch of other resources that I listed here. Probably the best that you'd want to hand out to somebody would be that study that I mentioned by FEMA, the supplemental study. It's a shorter study that has a lot of tables in there that give very good average cost, so they can do a good comparison of if I wanted to build it at the bare minimum today, if I wanted to build it at higher elevation or raise it down the line. There's a lot of other resources here. If you guys want to look into any of those things, I could certainly make this available, but that ends my presentation.
Okay, would you mind unsharing your screen?
Certainly.
There we go.
Does that work? Okay.
Yep. We have maybe a couple minutes for questions. I do see that Jennifer is on. There was some confusion over the timing, a time zone confusion issue. So have time for a couple of questions. In terms of making it available, and I should have mentioned this at the beginning, we are recording this. I hope that's not a problem for anybody. And we'll reach out to ASFPM office about getting it posted on our committee's website, and then we can send out the link. Otherwise, you could possibly reach out directly to the speaker. I think there was one other question.
Hey, Bill.
Yeah.
We are going to look to see if any CECs are offered for this, correct?
Yeah, and that question just came up, and we'll we'll ask the gurus at ASFPM whether we can do
Okay.
that. I'm hopefully, I do have a list of participants. I'm not sure at the end if that list gets saved or not. That's something
Okay.
we'll have to look into. Stacy, do you want to introduce Jennifer?
I will. Our next guest is Miss Jennifer Riley Collins. She's from my home state of Mississippi. She has a master's in criminal justice administration from the University of Central Texas and her doctorate of jurisprudence from Mississippi School of Law. She's an attorney licensed both to practice in state and federal court. She has written on issues ranging from the impacts of justice and equality to include criminal justice reform, juvenile justice, environmental justice, poverty, LGBT rights, and voting rights. She is a retired colonel of the United States Army after serving 32 years as a military intelligence officer, and she has received numerous commendations and distinctions. Miss Riley Collins is principal owner and consultant of J. Riley Collins Consulting, LLC, where she provides administrative, operational, and programmatic support to private, public, and nonprofit. We are pleased to have her here today, and with all these awards and accommodations and distinctions, she is, her greatest role in her life is being mother of 3 sons, Joseph, Jonathan, Joshua, and grandmother of Travis, Michael, and Drew Riley. Miss Riley Collins, you want to take over?
I sure will. Thank you so very much. And my apologies. I had this on my calendar and I did not pay attention to the time zone. So please forgive me. I have a brief time to share with you. Stacy allotted me about 15 minutes. And so I want to jump right in. A lot of this may be a refresher to many of you, but I was asked to speak on environmental justice and particularly, you know, for floodplain managers, land use. And so I want to kind of do some highlights over environmental justice, what it is not. And then we'll kind of drill down a little bit closer to what floodplain managers can do to ensure that environmental justice is available. I believe my screen is shared, so I'm gonna, let's see, make it go forward here somehow. There you go. All right. So what is environmental justice? This is the definition directly from the Environmental Protection Agency, from the EPA. It's the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people when it comes to the enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. I stress, if you're hearing my voice, the meaningful involvement of all people. Just having something up on your website and saying, you know, people can come to this town hall is not always a meaningful involvement. And so we'll look at that a little bit more, but I do want to stress that it's the fair treatment and meaningful involvement. That conjunction is important. What is environmental injustice? Environmental injustice is the disproportionate community exposure to pollution, racism, and the adverse effects. So it's the disproportionate, that's what community injustice is. And so if you look at the chart that's on the slide, you'll see when you talk about disproportionate exposure, Latinx Americans are 63% more likely to live in areas where there is pollution. African Americans, Black Americans are 56% more likely to be exposed, not more likely, more exposed. While you see non-Hispanic white Americans are exposed 17% less to pollution than they produce. And so you see the disproportionality in the exposure. What is environmental racism? And I'm going through these definitions because very often these terms are used interchangeably and they're not the same. So environmental racism, the definition, environmental discrimination, environmental racism is environmental policy making, the enforcement of regulations, the deliberate targeting of communities of color for toxic waste facilities, the official sanctioning of life-threatening presence of poisons and pollutants in our communities, and the history of excluding people of color from the leadership of ecology movements. So now I'm gonna go back again. It's the fair treatment and meaningful involvement. If you truly wanna have environmental justice so that you're not dealing with environmental injustice, the disproportionate exposure, and therefore then being accused of environmental racism, you have to make sure that you include everyone who is impacted and make sure that you're not targeting communities. Like when we talk about targeting communities of color for waste facilities, are you putting that landfill, which is a potential environmental hazard in this community, because people have less resources to fight back against that? We know that this is not new. This chart and all of these sources are sources that are available publicly on the internet, but you'll see that race is the most significant predictor of a person living near contamination, air pollution, water pollution, soil pollution. This chart is startling. 56% of the population near toxic waste sites are people of color. So given the stats, you can't say that those areas were not particularly targeted. When you're looking at environmental justice, you have to ask, were those people even considered, or was there a conversation with the community that we're gonna put this toxic waste site here, that this is going to be the impact of having these pollution generating plants? You know, we go in often and we talk about the establishment of jobs in communities, but we have to talk about the ancillary impacts as well, because these ultimately result in people having health hazards. You know, is anyone familiar with what this is a picture of? You can take your mic off mute if you like, if you know what this is a picture of. It's a picture of an area very near us here in Mississippi. This is what's called Cancer Alley, which is a stretch of oil refineries in Louisiana that runs really from Mississippi over into Louisiana near Baton Rouge, across to Houston, to Houston, Texas. And so what has been found to happen in Cancer Alley is you have, as a result of environmental injustice, you have health problems that are both physical and mental, and then developmental problems with children that are developmental delays. You have inadequate access to healthcare and preventive care, lack of access to healthy foods. It is all of this is perpetual. So I don't need to read the slide to you, but you see this is what happens when you have disparity in how we are managing our environment. Floodplain management and environmental justice. The picture in the slide is actually from 2020. Last year in our capital city and capital county here in Hinds County, Mississippi, well, I'm not there right now. There was a huge flood. It's like one of those 100-year floods type situations. And so it was very interesting how that has all played out, because the reality is nobody's done anything about the flooding, because it only occurs every so often. And guess what? Where does it hit? It hits in areas where very often people don't have the money to make the adjustment. So flood control infrastructure deliberately redistributes flood water. Sometimes it says, okay, well, we'll run the risk of running the water there instead of over there. And so that's deliberate injustice. Disadvantaged communities are burdened with unjust floodwater distribution. You have environmental injustice as a result of some flood control planning. People in the 9th Ward in New Orleans would argue that is environmental justice in their community about how flood planning was done. And flood adaptation is advocated as an alternative for flood hazard mitigation. So as you think about, and I should have put a space there, my apologies. As you think about floodplain management and its impact on environmental justice, think about flood adaptation, not just water redistribution. So what can floodplain managers do to ensure that we have truly environmental justice, not injustice, not environmental racism or discrimination? So you need to understand the particularity and the difference of vulnerable. That's a mistypo, excuse me, of vulnerable conditions. You know, so if we are flowing the water there, if we're doing flood distribution, what's the impact on this community? What allows in our policies that engagement that we talked about in the first definition, that make sure that people have an opportunity to be heard, and develop comprehensive and inclusive governance mechanisms, and use some tools that are available to you. This is the environmental justice screening and mapping tool that you guys are probably much more familiar with than I am, but I thought it was very interesting in that this tool actually allows you to, it includes some of the vulnerability indicators, 11 of them, and you can literally put in an address, click, you know, using the map and see what your risks are. And I think as educators of the public, as people working with the public, you should educate your public officials on this, but also educate the community so that they will see these are the hazards that have been mapped and the risk that is available to us when we are making these decisions. I was also asked in my prompt to touch on the National Flood Insurance Program. This is also a picture from the recent flood here in Mississippi. And I will tell you, I have some notes that I can't see. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna stop sharing my screen just a second because I wanna see my notes because there's some points I definitely wanna make here, but I wanna be mindful of the time. So under the National Flood Insurance Programs, households located in the most at-risk floodplains identified by MEMA as special flood hazard areas are mandated to purchase insurance. I want to stress, and I'm kind of struggling with my mouse here. I want to stress that sometimes we mandate things not thinking that we're putting people in a catch-22 in bit of a do loop. the FEMA prices are higher. FEMA prices, those premiums higher inside the special flood zones than outside, since these properties are more susceptible to significant flooding. We get that. Therefore, if low-income residents in that SFHA is able to afford a mortgage on their home, then in that zone, they would also be required to purchase flood insurance, probably at an unaffordable price. I hope you're beginning to hear the environmental justice concerns arising. Since those incomes tend to be lower inside of those zones, many of the residents there likely rent their properties. They're not purchasing them because they can't afford the mortgage and the insurance. Rental property residents are not required to purchase the flood insurance under the National Flood Insurance program. So inside of many high flood risk zones, low income families opt out for protecting their homes. They, you're already having to decide between food and pharmacy, but now this would force them to choose between food and flood insurance. Using the United States Census, FEMA determined that of the national flood insurance policies residing inside of those hazard areas, only 20% are 26% are low income, and 51% of the non-policy households are low income. These statistics show that low income minority populations might be evaluating whether purchasing flood insurance is worth the cost and determining that it's unaffordable. I have some more notes here, but that's kind of being redundant, so I'll come back to the screen and share my screen just once more. Okay, so unless I just wanted to leave you all with this last quote from Aristotle. If justice is giving people what they deserve, it is environmentally unjust and not only moral, but also socially irresponsible to consider human rights merely as a personal value and exclude certain groups of people from institutional supports. So again, going back to definition 1, I encourage, remember that and is a conjunction. What's your function? It connects. And so people have to have an opportunity to fully participate when decisions are being made that impact their health, impact their bottom dollar, being able to also share in the American dream. When we start thinking about environmental justice, it's not just about hugging trees and saving certain wetlands. It is also about taking care of our neighbors to our left and right. Thank you all for the opportunity. I hope, again, I apologize for getting my time zones confused. But if you have any questions for me, to the best of my ability, I will answer those. Again, if you want to learn more about me, I'm somewhere on the internet and at J. Riley Collins Consulting.
Thank you, and we're running a little late because we thought we had more time earlier, which it turned out we didn't have now. So what I'm going to ask people to do is, if you have a question for Jennifer, can you put it in the chat window? And Jennifer, you can answer there, and then we can move on to our next speaker.
Thank you for squeezing me in.
Okay.
Thank you.
And if you
I'll
could
stop sharing here.
Okay. So our next speaker is Peter Adams. Peter is a senior policy advisor on land use planning and buildings for the New York City Mayor's Office of Resiliency. Following Peter directly will be Joshua Lippert, who's a floodplain management for the city of Philadelphia and vice chair of the Pennsylvania Association of Floodplain Managers. So we'll be talking about some big city issues. We're going to go a little long. We'll eliminate our Q&A and our last 5-minute closing comments, but we will keep the Zoom open and the recording going in case people have to leave right at the top of the hour. So take it away, Peter, and share your screen if you'd like.
Great. Thanks, Bill, and thanks everybody for having me today. It's been interesting to listen in to these discussions so far, and eager to share with you some of what we're working on in New York City. No slides for me today. I'll just go over my notes. But yeah, what I wanted to talk about today was how New York City is addressing flood risk in a changing climate to increase the resiliency of our built environment, and how we're doing this through a series of regulatory approaches. Climate change is real, and it's a problem in New York City, and we face challenges now. We're going to face more challenges in the future, and we need to do a lot at a local level to address that risk. So I'm going to share what we're doing today to try to provide it as like a model for how this kind of regulatory action can be taken at a local level, how we're doing it, what my role and the role of my colleagues is, and why we're doing it. What are the motivations for this? So resiliency, the idea that we need to mitigate risk from extreme weather, from climate change, is something which New York's been working on for many years now, really going back to 2008 when the previous mayor, Bloomberg, started talking about this at the highest levels of city government here, saying climate change is real, it's going to affect New Yorkers in a lot of ways, we need to do something about it. We've been working on this for many years now. I've been with the city for almost 5 years, and a lot of things have happened. Hurricane Sandy in 2012 was a huge galvanizing event. But I'm going to talk about a lot of other work that we've done sort of unrelated to Sandy today, because Sandy, spurred a lot of recovery action, a lot of large coastal protection systems, a lot of really important work. But the risk from extreme weather doesn't, it can't always be answered with a huge coastal protection system. And there's other things we have to do. And that's really what I want to talk about today. I'm also going to be talking about all of this really from the perspective of our office, which is the Mayor's Office of Resiliency, where I sit. It's kind of a unique entity, I think, in that it is about 25 people fully focused on resiliency, doing all kinds of different things. But we are not housed in a department of the city or a specific agency. We have a central role, and that means we have an opportunity to coordinate and provide leadership to a wide variety of city agencies in terms of advocating for new policies and new standards to address resiliency, and demonstrating leadership in what the city can do. A few of the big things that we do from our office are, first and foremost, we convene this body called the New York City Panel on Climate Change. It is a group that's been around for 13 years now, of some of the best academic minds in the world who help us come up with local climate projections. We know the climate's changing. We have projections that occur at a variety of scales. But if you're going to make local choices about future flooding, you need local data. And so with the New York City Panel on Climate Change, we have this, this bedrock of local, high-quality, peer-reviewed data that is really the foundation of almost all of our policy and everything that we do. Because without having an insight into what future conditions are going to be like, we wouldn't be able to plan for them effectively. So that affects many aspects of our work, and we do lots of work related to coastal flooding, to extreme rain and the flooding that causes, and high heat. I'll really be talking mostly about coastal flooding today. And the work that we do around coastal flooding takes on many forms, whether it's trying to build awareness of current and future flood risk, providing better access to insurance, helping people recover from Sandy, and improving flood risk disclosure, and much more. There's many things that we do to help New Yorkers manage flooding. We also have this, like I said, a coordinating role where we work with many city agencies who all hold sort of a piece of the puzzle, which are all helping increase the resiliency of the city. And it's our role to help articulate the goals and push for them and provide agencies with the support they need. So some of those agencies are our Department of Buildings, who administer our local building code and oversee code development. They also house our floodplain administrator. It's a really important place for where flooding is managed and addressed in the city, and an important partner with us We work with city planning, who oversees zoning in the city, and we have a very large waterfronts team that does great work on resiliency. We work closely with our Office of Emergency Management, who address flooding today and in the near term. We work closely with our city council, our local legislative body, who not only oversee and pass and approve the building code updates that Department of Buildings puts forward, but also has a crucial role in helping us push and mandate other policies, as well as incorporating resiliency into our city budget. We also work with pretty much every city agency out there to make sure that resiliency is being addressed in their area. So whether that is public hospitals, whether that was or schools or parks or our infrastructure, resiliency has to be addressed in many different ways. So our office has this role, this coordinating role, this role of making sure we have the right data, the right inputs, and pulling together all the different pieces of resiliency in the city. When it comes to addressing flooding through regulation, all of these relationships and all of these things really have to get woven together in a pretty complex way. And let me go quickly through what this looks like. One of the key things that we've done in recent years is develop the resilient design standard for city capital projects. And actually, Jason in a previous presentation referenced this, which I was happy to see. This is a local design standard for addressing climate change in New York City. Climate change impacts are going to vary widely, and local conditions are going to vary widely. We needed a standard that helped us understand how we could use the climate data that we had from our academic partners. And so if you take a look at those guidelines, and I can share a link to them, it walks designers and planners through citing a facility. If you are citing in a place that is in a zone that is going to experience tidal inundation in the future, that's a huge issue. That might undermine the integrity of your building. That might make it impossible to access your building. That needs to be considered in design, and that is a real risk we face with sea level rise. If you are building in the floodplain today, you need to account for, essentially a higher freeboard standard, a standard that includes sea level rise. And again, like Jason said, that is determined on the useful life of the building. So a long-lived building is going to have more of an extra boost, up to 36 inches of extra freeboard on top of the 1 or 2 feet the code already require, or as little as 6 inches if it's a short-lived building. But that's necessary to maintain that freeboard margin of error, that safety buffer that freeboard constitutes. We're also looking at the future floodplain, because sea level rise and higher flood elevations aren't just going to be a vertical problem, it's also a horizontal problem. And there are parts of the city which have historically been high and dry, places where you're not required by the building code to design to deal with flooding, which might actually be at risk in the future. And so we need to make sure that we are considering the greater horizontal extent of the floodplain in the future. We developed this standard with input from DOB, from city planning, from all capital agencies in the city. We're excited now that our city council has picked this up and wants to pass it as a mandate, where all city capital projects, so public projects like schools and housing and city buildings, all have to be designed to this standard. And that's a huge step forward. We've spent about 4 years developing this standard, honing it with all of our colleagues and experts in and out of the city. And now we're at a place where the city can lead through example by making sure that in its capital program, when we are providing the buildings and services that New Yorkers rely on most, we are doing so in a way that's going to withstand the impacts of climate change. But that's just one piece of the puzzle, right? Because that's a design standard. That's how we can build to a greater level. And it's really focused on city capital projects, the public buildings that New Yorkers rely on and that are invested in with public dollars. But there's a lot more going on. Our Department of City Planning has made huge strides over the years to increase options for resiliency through zoning. They're currently in the final public review stage of a huge update called Zoning for Coastal Flood Resiliency, which is going to basically give everyone, public and private developers alike, the opportunity to have much more flexibility when they're designing in a coastal area. It's going to give more flexibility to the city, to the DOB as well, to define what the coastal area is, that we can define it as a larger area as the floodplain increases. And that will be crucial to allow people to build to a higher standard where necessary and to account for the spatial impacts of flood resilient design. We're also developing in our office future flood risk maps. We currently have an understanding of the future floodplain where we just take FEMA's insurance maps, add sea level rise, do a little GIS analysis, and we get a map, a bathtub map it's called, that indicates where the future flood map is going to be. But it's sort of a jury-rigged product. We need something that is going to be easier and more effective to use. And so we are working with FEMA to design a new kind of flood map, a flood map that depicts future conditions, a flood map that shows us greater flood extents, greater flood elevations, and changes in the flood zones, the V and the A zones that we need as designers. Because when we design something today, we're looking into the future. We're designing something which needs to last for decades. And if we keep relying on flood insurance maps that are from FEMA, we're always kind of looking to the past. We're looking at historic data to understand flood risk. We need forward-looking maps that depict sea level rise and the future floodplain. And that's something which we're developing now. Those maps are going to be really useful for a lot of reasons. We're going to use them for the city in our capital program, but we also really need them if we're going to take some of the big steps in the future, which involve updating our building code. DOB has already made a lot of updates over the years to increase the standard of protection in the building code, and more updates are on the way. And right now, depending on the building type, 1 to 2 feet of freeboard are required. We use the more restrictive of the 2 FEMA insurance maps that are currently available for New York City, but we need to do more. And so by taking all these different pieces of the work that we're doing, we're building towards a place where in a few years, I hope to see, very large code updates that are forward-looking, where we have a new type of flood reference map that is not just an insurance map from FEMA, but is rather a design-focused map that includes sea level rise. We have a zoning framework which allows us to have the flexibility to build taller and to design resiliently in our coastal areas. And we also have those design guidelines, which I mentioned at the top, where the real ins and outs of resilient design have been refined and improved. And we're able to take elements of that, which are currently being pushed forward for city projects, and really bring them to everybody through the building code. So there's a lot of reasons to do this, but I'm going to wrap up quickly. But one of the big reasons I want to just emphasize is, and tying to the previous speaker, is resiliency is an equity issue. Increasingly, we're finding that people, private developers building in coastal areas will advertise the benefits of resiliency in their building. They'll say how their building has backup energy systems and a flood protection system and all these things which are meant to entice people to live, to buy and rent in their building. And that makes sense. Flood risk is increasing everywhere, and people recognize the risk like never before. But we can't just wait for the private sector to act of their own accord. We have to make sure that we are using the best available data to hold all construction and all development to a high standard of resiliency, so that all New Yorkers are safe. All New Yorkers have an opportunity to live in a building that can withstand extreme weather. And it's difficult to figure out exactly what resiliency means, but that's what we're trying to do by pulling all these pieces together. So that was a lot, but that I just wanted to go through. It's just sort of, a process, and it's an example from, just one place in New York City, but it's how we are trying to pull together our goals around resilient design and really build a regulatory framework which is going to serve New Yorkers and keep them safe, even in the face of extreme weather and climate change. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Peter. And I don't know if you noticed, but one of the city's predecessors in the building department from some years back is on the call. James Colgate is here. But in order to save time, I'd like to turn it over to Josh, who I think does have some slides. And if we have time afterwards, then we can open it up. Josh, are you there? Bear with us. I don't see Josh in the speaker list anymore. I know he was here. And having said that, let me see if I got an email. Well, I guess we have a minute for questions if you have any.
I have a question. This is James Colgate, the person from the DOB from years ago. So in New York City, you said that you're thinking of a whole lot of new regulations and changes that are coming up. Are those the ones that are expected to be introduced to the city council as part of the regular building code revision? Or are you thinking bigger picture, larger ideas that are out there, like this idea of maybe using maps that go way beyond the FEMA areas? Maybe you can expand on that a little.
Yeah, so both really. DOB is, currently in the final, weeks and months of its code update cycle, and that has included some major updates that are forthcoming to the Appendix G of the building code. All of it has to be reviewed and approved by City Council, of course, as you well know. So, there's still some time before we see exactly what happens. But DOB's been hard at work through this code update cycle to digest and account for changing standards locally, nationally, internationally, and reflect that in the code. So there are some changes coming, pending approval from council in the near term. But we are casting our eyes further than that. I think as the new code update cycles, which will take a few years to come around, as well as City Council reviews and digests the latest information on climate change. I think that we're going to see more and bigger changes in the future as awareness of risk grows, and as the national and international consensus around resilient design coalesces. Even very recently, City Council proposed legislation to increase freeboard for all building types up to like three feet plus for everything, just across the board. There was a hearing for that last week. I don't know if that's going to go anywhere. I don't know if that's going to happen, but that, I think it reflects sort of the interest and appetite that we see among our elected officials to keep pushing for a higher protection standard. I see a question in the chat box from Lisa. I could answer that maybe. Lisa asked, how are you handling for requests for increases in density in high-risk coastal areas? It's a good question and a tough one. New York is very highly exposed to flooding today, and it's just going to get worse. More than 25% of the city is in the floodplain, and it's a lot of people, a lot of buildings. So it's a constant challenge, and one that we are addressing in sort of a variety of ways, depending on the neighborhood and the kind of risk that exists there, as well as sort of the range of options we have to reduce the risk there. There are some communities that have experienced a lot of flooding, which are very difficult to protect for just sort of geographical reasons, particularly around Jamaica Bay. And city planning has passed some zoning rules for those communities where they cannot get any denser, basically. So there have been some new restrictions there to limit that density. But in many other parts of the city, and obviously Manhattan's a big one, but Manhattan's certainly not the only one. There are many dense communities at high risk, which are going to, these communities aren't going anywhere. We're talking about millions of New Yorkers. And so I think it really, underlines the importance of finding ways to help keep them safe. And that's really what we're trying to do here by increasing our regulatory standards around resiliency and around flood design, because there's a lot of work that needs to be done and a lot of New Yorkers who are increasingly in harm's way.
So unless there are more questions, I think we could have some closing comments. One of the people we invited to this call originally, but was unable to schedule it, was John Gargiola from FEMA, who's with their building sciences unit. And when he reached out to me, I said, well, we've already got a full agenda. What he wanted to talk about was the relationship between higher standards, FEMA regulations, and the International Building Code, and what direction they're going with that. I recommended that we have a separate meeting that's really focused on that, no more than 1 hour. So keep your eyes open for that. We haven't scheduled it yet. Also, if you haven't heard yet, ASFPM's spring conference scheduled for Raleigh, North Carolina will be an all virtual conference. Usually the conference comes with a meeting like this one for each of the committees. We will discuss what we will do instead of that. But that also begins sort of our annual working cycle. Open it up to any comments or questions for another minute, and otherwise we'll give you part of your day back. Stacy, anything to add?
Just thank everybody for attending today. Thank the presenters. And if you want to be a part of that core group, don't forget to email me and Bill, and we'll put you on that core group distribution list.
Okay, thank you, everybody, and we'll close down the meeting.